welcome to Cashing In on Content Marketing. I'm Amanda Milligan, the Marketing Director at Fractal, and every week on the show I interview marketing experts about the ways to know the value of your work and get buy-in for your strategies. This week we're exploring reasons why your content might not be ranking from a technical SEO perspective. Joining me is none other than the super smart, not a robot, technical SEO at Deep Crawl, Jamie Indigo. I've watched her presentations on the human side of tech SEO, and this is not my area of expertise, but I've found all of her talks fascinating, and I'm so excited to have you on the show, Jamie. Welcome.
Thank you so very much for having me. It is an absolute pleasure.
I have the pleasure of having met you because of D&D, so
yes,
I love that. We have a bi-weekly campaign that I've so very much enjoyed.
And you play a fantastic cleric who my tiefling warlock absolutely adores.
Which I'm grateful for. My character needs a lot of help. Like I mentioned, I'm really happy to have you here because this is not my area. I don't know very much about tech SEO. But I know it's important when you're creating content or working on the SEO side to make sure that everything you're creating is showing up the way you want it to. So let's start at the very beginning. You talk a lot about rendering. What is rendering? What are we talking about here?
Rendering, very simply, is the process of turning HTML into pixels on the page.
Okay.
It goes through this glorious pixel pipeline, becomes content that users can see.
Got it. Yeah. So why is this important for content people to at least be aware of that this is a thing, a problem that could happen?
Well, this is an excellent question. Fundamentally, you content marketers, you find folk who understand how rankings work, which I have no business in. You need to know about rendering because that which is not rendered cannot rank. If it can't be discovered by Googlebot, it can't be shown in SERP. And Google is code. Code runs in a sequential order. It crawls, it renders, it indexes. And if we don't hit those first three steps, you can't show up in SERP. All of your on-page optimization efforts are for naught.
Yeah, so extremely important for all of us in the SEO business. So for people, especially the podcast focuses more on content folks who may not be aware of how all this happens, right? Do you see problems arising with rendering often? I'm kind of wondering, like, what is the level of occurrence that there are problems happening in this area?
Oh, so very frequently. If I make simply a reference to my inbox and the number of requests I have on a very regular basis,
really?
This is quite common. You got to think JavaScript is on 96, 97% of sites these days, and I'm referencing some W3 data and some built with data in that. Everyone uses JavaScript. We love it. If we look at a web page as being like a page in a book, Google essentially has this giant library. And when we look at what JavaScript does, it makes it into a pop-up book. It makes it interactive, and so we can engage with it. It has high value to folks who do content marketing because you have interactive pieces, you have call to actions, you have ways to get users to engage. That's all JavaScript. And in some cases, your entire page might be JavaScript. If you go ahead and do a view source, if you right click in your browser and you do view page source and you look at that and you see just a couple of lines or perhaps a lot of lines of absolute gibberish, you're likely looking at a JavaScript framework which is populating all of the content via client-side rendering.
Okay. So I had seen in some of the articles you'd written, and I'm going to link to the Search Engine Journal when you wrote that if you're listening to this and you want to know all the details, definitely recommend checking this post out.
The Angular article? The Angular article actually works for most JavaScript frameworks. I just didn't want to overstep when I wrote it, and I should perhaps get through and revisit that. It's my most popular article ever. It was my very first one.
Wow. Yeah, so that's why it's so fascinating to me, because I knew so little about it, but it's so prevalent and something that is very fundamentally affecting the work that we're all doing. We need to talk about it more. So JavaScript seems to be the main culprit here of the issues. So what are some examples of things that are going wrong?
So let me just start with when I very first worked on a JavaScript framework site, and that was an Angular one. The resources available to the SEO community included an article that was Angular is killing your SEO. And one of my points of pride in my career is that request for that article now instead redirect to mine, which was originally called the SEO's Guide to Angular Calm the F Down. And unfortunately, Danny would not let me publish that title. I call malarkey. Google can very readily execute JavaScript. It's a matter of how we do it. When we look at Web Core Vitals, they are a way of measuring how effectively we are putting content on the page. We are taking HTML and painting pixels to the page. It's similar to when we talk about a car and we talk about it having 30 miles to the gallon and X horsepower. That's a way of measuring the output of how it was built. It's the same when we look at Web Core Vitals and our rendering strategies.
Okay. So I assume when you have a smaller site, these kinds of things might be easy to identify, like that there's a problem, not the issue and how to solve it. But for bigger sites, like how do you go about troubleshooting what is correctly or incorrectly rendering at scale?
One of the most interesting things I noticed as I began really focusing my career on JavaScript issues was that the problems had a tendency to exist. There would be hreflang tags on the page, but Google's detection of them would be inconsistent and very small portion of them. When you start seeing things that you can't reproduce manually when you view the browser, chances are that's related to how the JavaScript is executing. Your browser is far more forgiving than the average crawler would be. And when you see things like missing canonicals, and you know very well there's a canonical there, or you see page titles that are inconsistent, that tends to be from JavaScript. One of the really interesting things about how Google translates your HTML into a full rendered piece of content is that it requests from the server, and what it gets back is called the crawl DOM. That's the initial HTML. Index processing will go through that and try and figure out what the page is about. If it answers a user intent, it'll then go ahead and identify all the resources you need to build that page and queues them all up for the web rendering service. This process is very quick these days. Back in 2018 at Google I/O, the webmaster analyst team announced that, whoopsie, we have a bit of a problem with this and it's quite problematic. They announced, hey, you should use dynamic rendering and give us a fully parsed HTML. They have since said, hey, dynamic rendering is not reasonable. And I do understand those listening right now are going, but when I go to the developer search docs, it says dynamic rendering. I understand it does. I don't know why it does. If you go ahead and watch the last Google Fireside chat. You'll see Martin, Gary, and John chatting, and that question does come up. And Martin is very clear in saying it is not reasonable. And at this point, Google's web rendering service is very, very effective. It can go ahead and basically take that page from crawl DOM to render DOM, which is the output of that initial HTML and all the resources, and have a complete page very, very quickly. Caveat there is if you are executing those resources in an unoptimized way, if you are just lobbing them all in once, then maybe your page isn't being fully rendered. If you have Googlebot obeys HTML5 protocol. And that means as it's crawling through the head, and the head declares all the resources we need to build that rest of the page, if while it's doing that, it encounters a tag that breaks the head, like an iframe, it's going to prematurely close the head. And that's why things like hreflangs, canonicals, and you're manually testing them, you're like, no, it's right there. But Googlebot's not seeing them. We have, in some cases, those tags being generated via JavaScript, which means their location in the head changes every time. They're not prioritized, so it's a matter of which server responded first, and that will cause this inconsistency. So really, my content friends, I know you love third-party tools, and they always promise to you that it's plug and play. Just put this one tag directly below the opening head tag, and I need you to repeat after me, not today, Satan. They don't know you're lying to you. They're sales folk. It's not personal.
That's super interesting because I feel like that's a situation a lot of people get in is they don't even realize when they use these third-party tools and they're just like copying and pasting.
Googlebot is code. Code runs in order. Code has rules. when Googlebot is going ahead and requesting your page and it's rendering that head to figure out all the resources it needs, and it encounters the closing head tag in an iframe. It encounters, assorted things that are not of HTML, H5 protocol. It closes the head, and everything that has to be in the head to be considered relevant and understood, metadata, canonicals, all of that gets moved to the body where it has no meaning.
Wow.
Protect the head.
Yeah, that's a great example of something you can look for that causes a lot of these problems. What are some other kind of like tricks that can improve rendering of a page? Like I know I had actually heard of lazy loading before this interview as something that is really beneficial. Are there any other kind of like simpler things like that people might overlook?
The fundamental principle is load what matters when it matters. If it doesn't contribute to actual pixels on the page, to the user's experience, if it is one of 17 third-party tracking pixels on your site, it can wait its turn. It can wait. Fundamentally, this is load what matters when it matters. When we talk about using lazy loading, so Googlebot actually uses Chromium as its web rendering service. Chromium is the same thing that runs Chrome. It runs a lot of browsers. It runs Slack. And it has taken up a lot of the slack. The webmaster team has asked SEOs to help in performance in a number of ways. And ultimately, Chromium's gone, no, we got this. So they adopted this native lazy loading tag, which is as simple as, img scr equal myfile.jpg, loading equal lazy. And it will be recognized and lazy loaded for your users, which means the content above the fold gets to be prioritized instead of content below the fold. No one cares about your footer if they can't see the content they came there for. Similarly, those lovely third-party tags that are in the head, if it is not asynchronous or deferred, you have to wait for that third party's server to respond, that script to come back, to be read, be folded like a beautiful little origami crane that it is, and then the page can continue rendering. If it is particularly slow in that response, this is blocking your rendering, or even worse, it can close the head prematurely. You might find your crawl budget to be quite amok if you're working on a JavaScript framework site.
Yeah.
So for example, you have a site that's using a lot of Ajax and it has a template. So all JavaScript frameworks basically work by going, here's a page template. And I have a database, and depending on what's requested, I will populate the data according to that. So I will load the template, and then I will load the content via these API calls. When we have a page like this, for example, at Air Electronics, I had product detail pages, and each one of them had 8 API endpoints that would populate in the content to show what was on the actual page, the product name, the product price, the availability of it. If those API endpoints are indexable, we now have a process where in Google's order of operations, it's crawled, it asked for 1 page, it got back 9 indexable items. And now in the deduplication process, it has to go through and figure out which of the 9 it intended to index. So my recommendation for this one, and it was highly effective with Arrow. We had a crawl of about 400,000 pages a day. We moved it to about 4 million by simply applying to each API endpoint an xrobots tag. So an API endpoint doesn't have a head tag. You can't add a meta tag into there, but you can on the server response header add in an xrobots directive that says no index. And that allows that deduplication process to be much cleaner. It's no longer sorting through 9. It has the page it requested and 1 indexable response.
Wow, no, that's a great example. It's helpful to walk through an issue that you've seen and a recommendation you've made. Something else you had talked about is the difference between rendering client side versus server side and making those types of decisions. Can you elaborate on that?
So I know Core Vitals is the absolute buzzword right now.
Yes,
you go ahead.
Is.
If you go and you look at the really wonderful web.dev documentation, and that is a collaborative project between the Google teams all over the place. I mean, even Chromium Chromium announced Web Core Vitals before Google Search did. They are the ones who created this human-centric initiative, and
Oh,
then
wow.
Google Search adopted it, and every other Google tool adopted it, so there was a unified metric. If you go ahead and read the wonderful documentation on optimizing your LCP, you'll see there are 4 causes of poor LCP. One of them is client-side rendering. Here's the thing. Client-side rendering is a bit like a flat pack piece of furniture. You ordered something from IKEA, and you now have to assemble it yourself. Your site is blind to whether or not the client assembled that correctly and where it broke if they didn't. You are putting more weight on their browser. Their browser's main thread, their browser's capability, or more likely their mobile phone's CPU, has to be the one to assemble that. If they are on a mobile device, they likely have a lower CPU. If they are on Wi-Fi, they have a faster connection, but if they're on 3G, it's quite slow. So if you are shipping them a ton of pieces to assemble, and a lot of those pieces don't actually contribute to what they're trying to build. So you ordered a bookshelf, you got half an ottoman, 3/4 of a bar stool, and a shelf that you don't know goes where. It's a lot of extra work on that provided no value. And this is one of the common issues we see with JavaScript is we ship things we don't need. Content on pages where it does not contribute. You can readily see this in Chrome. If you are good to go ahead and open up Chrome DevTools, you can also right click and go to Inspect and go to the 3 dots, go to More Tools and then Code Coverage. You'll see a little tool pop up in your DevTools and it'll ask you to reload the page. And when you do that, it'll tell you how much script, JavaScript and CSS, you shipped for that page and whether or not it contributed meaningfully to the content on it. I've seen sites shipping 7 megs and using 2.
Wow. Well, that is a great, yeah, just being able to check in that way is really great to know. So if somebody's listening to this and they're like, okay, I don't even know where to begin. I understand the importance of this. Where do I even get started? What do you think is like the first step someone should take in even just assessing any issues?
I actually wrote an intro guide to rendering to help folks understand this one. I think I'd like to go through and zhuzh up a little bit. Instead of writing new articles, I'm just going to refresh my old ones so they stay up to date.
That's a good content strategy.
Right? It's me meeting my commitment to SEJ. By the way, they don't pay authors, so that's just written with love and care and a desire to increase everybody a little bit more awareness about the basic functionalities of how the web works. You know, we're very dependent on the internet. We ask our phones questions every day. We inherently trust them, and we expect in our professional lives the information we publish to be available to users. So understanding the building blocks, the technical processes of which something must go through in order to have that meaningful transformation is valuable.
I can say that I literally had never given it any thought until I saw your content. So it has been really valuable.
Wonderful.
I'm still wrapping my head around it, but yeah, I absolutely have taken it for granted. I work in search and I had no understanding of the technical side of why things are showing up the way that they did.
Then please also read my article on ethics and SEO because everyday humans trust their phone, but we rarely think about why we trust them and how the information got there.
I don't remember which presentation of yours I watched. I don't remember where you presented it about the way that Google provides results and how we inherently trust what's there, but sometimes there aren't enough results, so it's not accurate. That was fascinating.
That really was Techno Day. That was Women in Tech's Techno Day.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Illusionary truth effect is very real. Data voids are something built into the fundamental concept of a search engine. Its goal is to return an answer to your query. And if there is nothing that matches that, or if there are simply disinformation sites presented to reinforce the idea of what you hear, some sensationalized data void being exploited, it works. We saw this with Wayfair on the human trafficking thing. All the sites that returned in SERP to go ahead and reinforce that. There was no substance to those articles, but humans, we are simply vulnerable to what's known as the illusionary truth effect. when we hear something repeated enough, we inherently and subconsciously believe it is truth. Yeah.
Yeah, when you see that rank, especially when you're so used to searching and trusting the first results, seeing those types of things, you're right. Like before you even click on it, it sends some kind of a signal to you that it's true.
Just seeing that thing repeated in title snippets and in metadata.
Yeah.
Most folks don't read articles. They read a headline. They read some
Mm-hmm.
highlighted blurbs. The digital age doesn't seem to blend well with nuance, but if we can embrace a understanding that these are fallible and biased programs that return us results, maybe we can all make it better. Yeah.
Well, that's a misconception of a lot of technical or AI type things, like, oh, it's
Oh,
objective.
so AI, or more accurately, machine learning, is built on a corpus. It's built on a knowledge set of data that it goes through and parses and scans, and it pulls out information from it. But it inherits the biases of its creators. It inherits the bias of the corpus that it's fed. It assumes and only knows that set of data to be truth. I mean, we've Google I/O. My eyebrows took a good hour or two lower back down as they kept talking about AI and very quickly glossed over ethics. There's very real life consequences to this. Here in Colorado, there is a university where students had to check into class using facial recognition AI, and those of darker skin tones weren't being picked up because the models were
Wow.
trained on white faces. Actually, Timmy Guru, who had been the lead AI ethicist at Google, quit, quote unquote. She was actually fired, but they've been as a resignation because of her open criticism to the inaccuracy of facial recognition, recognizing darker skin tones, basically non white men. It was unable to distinguish gender. We saw during the Black Lives Matter protests, there was a police force, I can't remember which city it was in, that was attempting to use facial recognition to identify protesters. The accuracy of it, particularly in darker skin tones, is so poor that it opened a whole area of deep, deep concern. And um, while they can gloss it over at the keynote, there is still a very real human toll to this, particularly as more and more of our fundamental infrastructure becomes dependent and assumptive that
Hmm.
these systems are truth.
No, it's really scary, and I had no idea the extent to which it was impacting folks until I saw your presentation. So I
Oh,
highly encourage people listening. Jamie has put so many fantastic resources out there for us, things that maybe we don't do on the day to day that are extremely important for us to understand, regardless. So thank
I
you for
mean,
doing that.
oh, thank you. It's definitely a labor of love. My disinformation article has by far the fewest views, but I think it's really important to teach SEOs how to be able to spot, how to be able to educate other folks on disinformation on essentially ways. When I wrote the article, actually, I talked to someone who had a background in psychological operations for the military, and we discussed how some of the tactics used currently in digital disinformation campaigns mirrors entirely psychological operations in warfare. So if you
Wow.
have a chance, I do recommend checking out that article. There is an insane overlay, and you as an SEO have the ability to see the systems, to see behind the velvet curtain. You know the pathways and how things get there, and we need that watchdog and advocacy. We need to tell everyone we know that it is a myth that search engines are unbiased. It is a myth that they are always right and true, and just be on top of it. I recently kind of raised a fuss on Twitter because there was a query of good people in history, and the rich result returned back a list that included Hitler. And it wasn't that the article was misrepresenting its content. It said people who change history. Hitler accurately, yes, changed history. The query was good. And the definition of good becomes the human aspect of this. How do we define good? It is a relative term, but when presented to humans on a large scale in a way that can be exploited,
Mm.
it's problematic.
It's frightening and fascinating and really important that we understand it. We all have that ethical responsibility that I think we might forget about in the day to day when we're just doing our work, but how this all works, how it can impact people.
Yeah.
Really, really good for us to know. Jamie, knowing the objective of our show is to
yes.
help people in content, who would you recommend to be guests on future episodes?
To help people in content. Can you be a guest? I'll interview you. That'll work. That'll work lovely. Ruth Everett is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend. Ashley Byrne Hale is one of the most energetic and fantastic people. Gianna, I'm just going to call her Gianna Tentacles because I'm not actually sure I know her last name properly, and she will always forever be in my heart. Gianna Tentacles, a brilliant SEO out of Germany, who actually introduced me the idea of considering translations and ethics. The internet is almost entirely in English. It is an insane portion of it. And if we look at the ethical implications of not translating content, we're actually restricting ideas from coming into new groups. And there's a whole thing that plays out to it. She is absolutely brilliant, incredible at what she does.
Amazing. These are fantastic recommendations. I think I follow a few of them on Twitter, and I need to reach out and have them on the show.
Have you had Arij on yet? Arij is
so humble. I think I asked her, and she was like, have other people on the show. And I was like, you're just the best person.
Roxana Stingu. I got to do it was a tale of two cities kind of presentation. We had sister presentations on
yes, I wanted
how
to take
humans.
I love that.
She is brilliant. One of my favorite humans.
That's a great idea. I need to ask them to be on the show. Thank you for those recommendations. And thank you so much for coming on the show and enlightening us. It's something I'm still trying to understand, but it's so important and interesting. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to hopefully not rolling as terribly in our next D&D campaign. My tiefling, for those curious and who play D&D, my tiefling is based on Posh Spice. So she has terrible dexterity, very good fashion, and is not skilled with a crossbow.
We're still on the hunt for, boots that are made of suitable material?
Yes. She has very posh boots on. And one session I couldn't make. The players in my absence decided that she simply was not willing to go through the waterfall to fight the baddie, so she waited on the other side.
I love it so much. Thanks for coming, Jamie.
Thank you.
If you've listened to this and want even more tips, sign up for our podcast newsletter by going to the podcast page on the Fractal website. And if you've learned anything from this show, we'd love it if you'd subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and leave a review. Finally, if you have any feedback, suggestions, ideas, D&D DMing tips, or anything you'd like to share with me, shoot me an email at amanda@frac.tl. I'm a shameless extrovert who would love to hear from you. Thank you to Sean Kelly for podcast music and editing, and to Joao Pereira for logo design. And thank you, dear listener. I hope you'll join us next time.